In 1861, America fractured along a single fault line, slavery. Today, we're divided by wealth gaps wider than the Gilded Age, political tribes that view opponents as enemies, and a media landscape that reinforces opposing worldviews. The similarities are striking: Congress deadlocked and ordinary citizens losing faith in democracy itself. But here's what's truly alarming. 65% of Americans believe social media has made our political divisions worse, with record numbers identifying as strongly conservative or liberal and fewer as moderate. Are we witnessing history's deadly echo? Or is this time different? To answer that question, we must first understand what happens when a nation's political system stops functioning. The breaking point: political deadlock in 1850s America. The breakdown of a functioning political system reveals itself through clear warning signs. In the 1850s, America witnessed these signs firsthand as the decade before the Civil War demonstrated how quickly a democracy can unravel when its fundamental mechanisms of compromise fail. This wasn't simply a disagreement over policy. It was a complete breakdown of the political structures designed to resolve conflicts peacefully. The 1850s transformed Congress, particularly the Senate, into a battleground where sectional interests paralyzed the legislative process. For decades, American politics had functioned through careful balancing acts between North and South. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had maintained this equilibrium by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery in the remainder of the Louisiana Territory north of the 36 degrees, 30 minutes parallel. This arrangement wasn't perfect, but it provided a framework that both sections could reluctantly accept. That fragile peace shattered in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This legislation effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing settlers in these new territories to determine the slavery question through popular sovereignty. What might seem like a democratic solution, on paper proved catastrophic in practice. Kansas quickly descended into violence as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded the territory, each side determined to win the vote. Bleeding Kansas saw over 200 violent clashes between opposing settlers, illustrating the failure of popular sovereignty as a peaceful solution. The territory became a microcosm of the national crisis, a preview of the larger conflict to come. The Compromise of 1850 had briefly calmed tensions earlier in the decade. This complex package of legislation admitted California as a free state, organized Utah and New Mexico territories without restrictions on slavery, ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C., and strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act. Senator Henry Clay, known as the Great Compromiser, had crafted this solution in his final major act before his death. Yet within just 4 years, even this carefully balanced agreement collapsed under the weight of sectional antagonism. Congressional sessions during this period reflected the deteriorating national unity. Political discourse didn't just become heated, it turned violent. The most shocking example came on May 22, 1856, when Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina entered the Senate chamber and beat Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts unconscious with a cane. Brooks attacked Sumner over a speech criticizing pro-slavery forces in Kansas and personally insulting Senator Andrew Butler, Brooks's cousin. Sumner suffered head trauma, so severe he couldn't return to his Senate duties for 3 years. Rather than facing universal condemnation, Brooks became a hero in the South, receiving dozens of replacement canes from admirers. This incident wasn't an anomaly. Members of Congress routinely carried weapons into the chambers. Threats and challenges to duels became common. The legislative branch, designed as a forum for peaceful resolution of differences, had become a place where violence was increasingly seen as a legitimate extension of political disagreement. The political party system that had helped bridge sectional differences also collapsed during this period. The Whig Party, which had served as a national party with both northern and southern wings, disintegrated in the early 1850s primarily over the slavery issue. Its replacement, the Republican Party, formed explicitly as a northern, anti-slavery party with virtually no southern membership. This new political landscape eliminated one of the key institutional structures that had previously forced cross-sectional compromise. By 1860, the breakdown was complete. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single southern state, 7 states in the Deep South seceded before he even took the oath of office. The political system had so deteriorated that nearly half the country refused to accept the results of a constitutional election. What's particularly striking is that Lincoln had not campaigned on abolishing slavery where it already existed, only preventing its expansion into new territories. Even this moderate position proved too threatening to a South increasingly convinced that its entire way of life was under attack. This institutional failure wasn't solely about slavery, though slavery was the central issue. It reflected a deeper problem: the inability of American political structures to process fundamental conflicts over values, identity, and competing visions of the nation's future. When compromise becomes impossible, democratic institutions lose their primary function. Without mechanisms to peacefully resolve disputes, conflicts inevitably seek other outlets, in this case, military confrontation. The breakdown of political compromise in the 1850s created a situation where normal democratic processes could no longer contain sectional tensions. When citizens lose faith that the system can fairly address their concerns, they begin to view extra-constitutional measures as their only recourse. The South's decision to secede didn't happen suddenly. It came after a decade of escalating institutional failure that convinced many Southerners they could no longer protect their interests within the Union. As we examine today's political landscape, we should ask, are our institutions similarly failing to process our most contentious issues? The differences between 1861 and today are significant, but the warning signs of institutional breakdown deserve serious attention. When compromise becomes a dirty word, when political opponents are viewed as enemies rather than fellow citizens with different views, and when violence enters the political discourse, the parallels become harder to dismiss. What happens when reaching across the aisle becomes not just difficult, but politically dangerous? The lessons of the 1850s take on new relevance as we consider the state of our contemporary political institutions. Modern congressional gridlock, when compromise becomes surrender. What happens when the institutions designed to process our most difficult national conversations begin to fail? Today's Congress faces a crisis of functionality that echoes the legislative paralysis of the 1850s. The numbers tell a stark story. Only 16% of Americans approve of Congress's performance, according to recent polls. This isn't just typical public frustration with government. It represents a fundamental breakdown in our legislative branch's ability to perform its most basic functions. The root of this dysfunction lies in the ideological sorting of our political parties. Unlike previous eras, when both Republicans and Democrats contained liberal, moderate, and conservative wings, today's parties have become ideologically homogeneous. Conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans have virtually disappeared from Congress. The moderate middle has steadily eroded, with Gallup data showing that Americans who identify as moderates fell from 43% in 1992 to 34% in 2024. This shrinking center has left a vast chasm between two ideological camps with little overlap. This sorting creates a practical problem: who brokers the deals? Historically, legislative compromises were crafted by members who occupied the ideological middle, representatives and senators who shared some values with both sides and could translate between competing worldviews. These political translators have largely vanished, leaving two parties that increasingly speak different languages and operate from incompatible premises. The consequences appear in routine congressional business. Legislation that once passed with substantial bipartisan majorities now faces partisan blockades. Consider the basic function of passing annual budgets and appropriations bills. What should be routine fiscal management has transformed into recurring crises, with government shutdowns or near shutdowns becoming regular features of our political landscape. The debt ceiling, a formerly procedural vote that simply allowed the government to pay for spending Congress had already authorized, has become a hostage-taking opportunity that threatens economic stability. Procedural tools designed for rare circumstances have become standard weapons in this environment. The Senate filibuster offers a telling example. Originally a seldom-used procedure that required senators to actually hold the floor and speak continuously, it has evolved into a routine obstruction mechanism that effectively requires a 60-vote supermajority for most significant legislation. Cloture motions to end filibusters have risen dramatically over the past 30 years, helping to cement Senate obstruction as a standard practice rather than an exceptional one. The causes of this gridlock extend beyond Congress itself to the incentive structures shaping how representatives behave. Primary elections, which typically attract the most partisan voters, now pose a greater threat to incumbents than general elections. Representatives who compromise risk being labeled traitors to their party and facing well-funded primary challenges from more extreme candidates. The message becomes clear: compromise equals political death. This dynamic is reinforced by partisan redistricting, the drawing of congressional district boundaries to favor one party. When districts are crafted to be safely Republican or safely Democratic, representatives have little incentive to appeal to voters from the opposing party. Their real political threat comes from primary challengers who can portray them as insufficiently loyal to party orthodoxy. This creates a perverse incentive where representatives from the same state or region who should be working together for their constituents instead adopt opposing positions to satisfy their respective party bases. Media ecosystems compound these problems. Representatives know their actions will be scrutinized not just by mainstream press, but by partisan media, outlets eager to highlight any deviation from party orthodoxy. A vote for a bipartisan bill can be portrayed as betrayal, with clips and quotes stripped of context and amplified to outraged audiences. The representative who crosses party lines doesn't just risk losing their next election. They risk becoming the target of nationwide partisan fury. Campaign financing further entrenches these divisions. As political action committees and wealthy donors increasingly fund campaigns, representatives become dependent on sources that often demand ideological purity. The threat of funding being redirected to a primary challenger serves as a powerful deterrent to compromise. Why risk losing financial support by voting for legislation the other side also supports? This institutional paralysis mirrors the 1850s in disturbing ways. In both eras, we see a legislature increasingly unable to process the nation's most contentious issues through normal democratic channels. The specific issues differ dramatically. Nothing in today's political landscape matches slavery's unique moral, economic, and constitutional significance. Yet the pattern of dysfunction follows similar contours: hardening party lines, collapse of compromise mechanisms, procedural obstruction, and the transformation of political opponents into moral enemies. Perhaps most concerning is how this dysfunction creates a feedback loop with public perception. As Congress fails to address pressing national problems, public trust in government declines further. This declining trust makes citizens more receptive to extreme positions and less willing to accept compromises, which in turn makes effective governance even more difficult. The cycle reinforces itself, potentially leading to a complete breakdown of democratic processes. The lesson is clear. A democracy that cannot resolve its internal conflicts through established institutional channels becomes vulnerable to more extreme alternatives. But political gridlock is only one dimension of our national division. Beneath these surface conflicts lie deeper tensions, competing economic systems and interests that shape how different regions view the role of government itself. Economic systems in conflict, North versus South in 1861. Economic divisions in America have historically run deeper than political disagreements, often reflecting fundamentally different systems that struggle to coexist. In 1861, this economic incompatibility reached a breaking point. By the eve of the Civil War, the United States had evolved into two distinct economic regions with competing interests that proved impossible to reconcile through political compromise. The North and South didn't start as economic opposites. In the early republic, both regions focused primarily on agriculture. But by the mid-19th century, they had diverged dramatically. The North underwent rapid industrialization, building factories that produced textiles, machinery, and consumer goods. Railroad networks expanded, connecting manufacturing centers to markets. Financial institutions grew to support this industrial development, creating a complex, interconnected economy increasingly oriented toward internal markets. The South followed a radically different path. Its economy centered on plantation agriculture, an export-oriented system that produced cotton, tobacco, and other cash crops primarily for European markets. This wasn't simply a matter of agricultural preference. The Southern economy depended fundamentally on enslaved labor, without which its entire economic structure would collapse. By 1860, according to the census, approximately 4 million enslaved people lived in the South, representing about 1/3 of the Southern population and property valued at over $3 billion, an astronomical sum for the time. These different economic foundations created opposing policy needs. Consider tariffs, a persistent source of sectional conflict throughout the antebellum period. Northern manufacturers benefited from protective tariffs that shielded them from European competition, allowing American industrial concerns to develop without being undercut by more established foreign firms. The South, however, viewed these same tariffs as economically devastating. As exporters of agricultural products and importers of manufactured goods, Southern planters paid higher prices for everyday items while facing potential retaliation against their cotton exports if America raised tariffs too high. The 1828 Tariff of Abominations highlighted this tension. When Congress passed this highly protective measure, South Carolina threatened nullification, declaring the federal law void within its borders, and began preparing for possible military confrontation. While this crisis was temporarily resolved, it demonstrated how economic policy differences could escalate to threats of armed conflict decades before the Civil War began. Banking and currency policies created similar divisions. The North, with its growing industrial and commercial interests, favored a strong national banking system that could provide stable currency and financial services. Alexander Hamilton's vision of a robust financial infrastructure found natural support in the developing Northern economy. Southern agrarian interests, particularly the planter aristocracy, viewed centralized banking with suspicion. They preferred decentralized financial control that would preserve their autonomy and prevent Northern financial interests from gaining too much influence over the Southern economy. These weren't merely technical disagreements about interest rates or banking regulations. They reflected fundamentally different visions of America's economic future. The Northern vision emphasized internal development, industrial growth, free labor, and economic diversification. The Southern vision centered on agricultural exports, limited industrialization, enslaved labor, and preservation of an economic system that concentrated wealth among a relatively small planter class. As the nation expanded westward, these competing economic models battled for dominance in new territories. This wasn't simply a struggle for land or resources. It was a contest over which economic system would shape America's future. Would new states follow the Northern free labor industrial model or the Southern slave-based plantation system? Both sides understood that whichever economic system gained majority control of the federal government could implement policies favoring its interests while disadvantaging the other. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and other attempts to resolve the territorial question through political compromise ultimately failed because they addressed symptoms rather than the fundamental incompatibility of these economic systems. The conflict wasn't just about where slavery could exist, it was about which economic model would prevail in determining national policy. By 1860, the economic disparity between regions had become stark. The North, with approximately 21 million citizens according to the 1860 census, possessed 9 times the industrial capacity of the South, which had about 9 million people, including 3.5 million enslaved persons. The North produced 97% of a nation's firearms and dominated manufacturing, while the South produced just 3% of U.S. exports, despite its agricultural focus. The South's limited industrial base compared to the North's overwhelming arms production would prove decisive once conflict began. These different economic systems created distinct social structures that further complicated reconciliation. The Northern economy, though far from egalitarian, offered more diverse economic opportunities and greater social mobility. Its industrial development created an expanding middle class of professionals, shopkeepers, and skilled workers alongside industrial laborers and wealthy capitalists. The Southern economy produced a more stratified society dominated by a planter aristocracy at the top, with enslaved people at the bottom, and relatively limited middle-class opportunities between these extremes. These different social structures fostered divergent values and worldviews. The North increasingly embraced values associated with free labor, including individual opportunity, economic mobility, and education. The South developed an aristocratic ethos centered on honor, hierarchy, and tradition. These cultural differences, rooted in economic realities, made mutual understanding increasingly difficult as the sectional crisis deepened. The stark North-South economic divide of 1861 created irreconcilable policy needs that the political system couldn't accommodate, making conflict increasingly inevitable. When citizens in different regions experience fundamentally different economic realities, they naturally develop different understandings of their interests and rights. While today's economic divisions don't match the clean regional split of 1861, they nonetheless create different lived experiences that shape political perspectives in ways that strain our democratic institutions. The modern wealth gap, economic inequality in 2025. Today's economic landscape reveals a different kind of division, one that cuts across geographic boundaries but creates equally profound political consequences. America's current wealth gap presents troubling parallels to the past, though with crucial differences that reshape how inequality affects our national unity. The statistics tell a sobering story about the concentration of wealth that rivals even the most extreme periods in American history. Today's America faces levels of economic inequality not seen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. This isn't merely a matter of some Americans having nicer houses or cars than others. It represents a fundamental restructuring of economic opportunity and power. The implications for social cohesion and political stability run deep, as citizens increasingly inhabit different economic realities that shape their worldviews, priorities, and understanding of what constitutes a fair society. The numbers reveal the scale of this divide. The collective net worth of America's top 12 billionaires now exceeds $2 trillion, having increased by 193% between March 2020 and December 2024, according to the Institute for Policy Studies. This wealth accumulation occurred during a period when many Americans faced unprecedented economic hardship due to the pandemic and its aftermath. While millions worried about paying rent or affording groceries, the wealthiest Americans saw their fortunes nearly triple in just a few years. This concentration of wealth extends beyond just a handful of ultra-billionaires. The richest 1% now own 54% of all stocks and mutual funds, up from 40% in 2002. This shift means that when the stock market rises, the benefits flow disproportionately to a small segment of the population. For the majority of Americans who own little or no stock, the celebrated gains in market indices translate into minimal improvements in their financial security. The economic indicator that makes headlines often has little relevance to their daily lives. Housing, traditionally the primary wealth-building vehicle for middle-class Americans, has become increasingly unattainable for younger generations. The homeownership rate for adults under 35 has fallen to 30% in 2024, down from a peak of 50% in 1980. Recent economic estimates indicate that about half of American households cannot afford a $250,000 home, and a large majority cannot afford a median-priced home, now at $419,000. This housing affordability crisis further entrenches wealth inequality, as fewer Americans can access this traditional path to financial security. Unlike the regional economic divide of 1861, today's economic geography creates a more complex pattern. Prosperity concentrates in coastal cities and technology hubs, places like San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, and New York, while former manufacturing regions across the Midwest and parts of the South struggle with diminished economic opportunities. This has created what economists sometimes call superstar cities, where high-paying jobs cluster alongside prohibitive living costs that exclude many middle and working-class Americans. This geographic pattern doesn't follow the clean north-south divide of the Civil War era. Instead, it creates a patchwork of prosperity and struggle that crosses traditional geographic boundaries. Rural areas in northern states face similar economic challenges to those in the South. Wealthy enclaves exist in traditionally poorer states, while pockets of deep poverty persist in generally prosperous regions. The economic fault lines run not between states, but between urban and rural areas, between college-educated and non-college-educated workers, and between industries that benefit from globalization versus those disrupted by it. What makes these economic divisions particularly concerning is how they increasingly align with political affiliations. Recent analyses show that Democrats now represent districts that generate approximately 70% of America's GDP, while Republicans typically represent more economically challenged regions. This alignment of economic fortune with political identity creates a dangerous feedback loop where economic policy becomes even more difficult to address through bipartisan cooperation. When economic circumstances diverge, citizens naturally develop different perceptions of what constitutes fair economic policy. Those in prosperous areas may view globalization and technological change as inevitable and generally positive forces that create opportunity. Those in regions experiencing economic decline may see these same forces as destructive to communities and livelihoods. Neither perspective is wholly right or wrong. They reflect different lived experiences in an increasingly economically segregated nation. This economic divergence affects how Americans view fundamental questions about the role of government, taxation, social safety nets, and regulation. When citizens inhabit such different economic realities, finding common ground on these issues becomes exceptionally difficult. Policy debates transform from technical discussions about economic trade-offs into moral arguments about fairness, identity, and values. While different from a sectional economic divide of 1861, today's economic inequality creates similar political tensions and social distrust. The pre-Civil War conflict involved two geographically distinct economic systems with different labor arrangements, trade relationships, and infrastructure needs. Today's divide is more fragmented geographically, but no less significant in how it shapes political perspectives and priorities. The key question becomes whether these modern economic divisions are creating the same kind of unbridgeable political gaps that preceded the Civil War. Can a nation function when its citizens experience such radically different economic circumstances that they no longer share basic assumptions about how the economy should work? This question has no simple answer, but history suggests that extreme economic inequality, when coupled with geographic concentration and political polarization, creates conditions ripe for serious social conflict. Yet to fully understand whether today's divisions truly approach the breaking point of 1861, we must examine what made the Civil War era unique, the presence of a singular moral crisis that transcended economic and political concerns. The moral contradiction at America's foundation created a conflict unlike any other in our history. While economic divisions and political deadlock contributed to the Civil War, slavery represented a unique moral crisis that made compromise increasingly impossible. Understanding this singular nature helps us evaluate whether today's divisions, though serious, truly approach the breaking point of 1861. Slavery wasn't merely a political or economic issue. It represented a fundamental moral contradiction at the heart of American society. The nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal simultaneously maintained a system that denied basic humanity to millions of people. This contradiction created tensions that couldn't be resolved through normal political processes or typical legislative compromises. By 1860, approximately 4 million enslaved people lived in the South, representing about 1/3 of the Southern population and property valued at over $3 billion. This valuation exceeded the combined worth of all manufacturing and railroads in the United States at that time. Slavery wasn't a minor economic consideration. It formed the foundation of the entire Southern economic system. Cotton production, the South's primary export, depended on enslaved labor, as did tobacco cultivation and other agricultural enterprises that generated Southern wealth. This economic reality meant that slavery couldn't be addressed as a simple policy question. For Southern slaveholders, any threat to slavery represented not just a moral judgment, but an existential economic threat. The value of enslaved people often constituted the majority of a plantation owner's wealth. Abolition would have essentially wiped out the South's primary form of capital overnight, destroying the economic basis of the region's social structure. The moral question of slavery created an ideological divide that was unmatched in intensity and intractability. Both sides increasingly viewed the other as existentially threatening to their way of life and understanding of America itself. This wasn't a disagreement that could be split down the middle or resolved through mutual concessions. The fundamental question, whether humans could be property, allowed no middle ground. Abolitionists viewed slavery as an absolute moral evil, a sin against both God and the founding principles of the Republic. They saw it as a stain on American democracy that undermined the nation's claims to moral leadership. For many abolitionists, particularly those motivated by religious conviction, compromising with slavery was not merely politically unwise, but morally unconscionable. How could one partially oppose a system they viewed as fundamentally evil? Southern defenders, particularly after the 1830s, increasingly portrayed slavery not as a necessary evil, but as a positive good essential to their way of life. They developed elaborate theological, scientific, and sociological justifications for the institution. Slavery, in their view, maintained a proper social order, provided care for those they considered incapable of caring for themselves, and represented a divinely ordained relationship between races. This transition from defending slavery as a necessary compromise to celebrating it as a positive institution made reconciliation increasingly impossible. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 brought the moral conflict directly into Northern communities in unprecedented ways. This legislation required Northern citizens to actively participate in capturing and returning escaped slaves, even if they personally opposed slavery. It created a situation where Northerners faced legal penalties for following their moral convictions. This direct involvement forced many previously indifferent Northerners to confront the realities of slavery as they witnessed the human impact of the system in their own communities. Religious institutions split along sectional lines over slavery, demonstrating how deeply the issue penetrated American social structures. Southern Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians formed separate denominations specifically to defend the institution of slavery. These religious divisions reflected and reinforced the growing cultural separation between North and South. When churches, institutions meant to unify believers around shared values, could no longer maintain national unity, it signaled a profound fracturing of American society. No modern political issue combines the same elements of moral absolutism, economic entrenchment, and constitutional crisis that slavery presented. Contemporary disagreements, while serious, typically allow for compromised positions or incremental approaches. Even on deeply divisive issues like abortion, taxation, or immigration, various middle ground positions exist that substantial portions of the population find acceptable. Slavery offered no such middle ground. One either supported human bondage or opposed it. Slavery created a uniquely intractable divide that modern issues don't match, combining moral, economic, constitutional, and identity factors in a way no current controversy does. It simultaneously represented a moral crisis, an economic system, a constitutional question about federal versus state authority, and a fundamental component of Southern identity. This combination made it resistant to the normal mechanisms of political compromise and negotiation. The institution of slavery also directly affected the interests and rights of millions of people who had no voice in the political system. Unlike most political questions where all affected parties can theoretically participate in the democratic process, enslaved people themselves were excluded from any say in their fate. This created a structural problem that democratic processes alone couldn't resolve. How could a system fairly address an issue when those most affected by it were systematically excluded from participation? Understanding slavery's singular nature helps us assess whether today's divisions, while serious, truly approach the breaking point that made civil war inevitable. Today's political landscape features deep divisions, but they lack the same geographic concentration, the same economic entrenchment, and the same moral absolutism that characterized slavery. This doesn't mean our current divisions are trivial. They remain serious challenges to democratic governance, but it suggests that the specific conditions that made compromise impossible in 1861 may not be fully present today. While slavery represented a unique moral crisis with no middle ground, today's America faces a different challenge, a landscape where Americans increasingly operate from entirely different moral frameworks. This raises a troubling question. What happens when citizens no longer share even basic assumptions about right and wrong? Culture wars and identity politics, today's moral battlegrounds. Contemporary America's moral landscape reveals fractures that challenge our collective identity in profound ways. Unlike the singular moral question of slavery, today's cultural conflicts create a complex web of disagreements about what it means to be American. These conflicts extend beyond policy preferences to fundamental questions about rights, values, and national purpose. While they lack slavery's unique moral clarity, they nonetheless create fault lines that increasingly strain our ability to function as a unified society. Modern America faces increasingly bitter conflicts over fundamental values and identities. Unlike the 1850s, when the moral question of slavery provided a clear dividing line between North and South, today's moral landscape features multiple overlapping issues that resist simple categorization. This creates a more complex moral environment where Americans might agree on some issues while fundamentally disagreeing on others. The result is a web of moral disagreements rather than a single defining moral question. Issues like abortion, LGBTQ+ rights, immigration, and racial justice have transformed from policy debates into moral litmus tests that define political tribes. These aren't simply disagreements about what policies would best serve a nation. They represent fundamentally different understandings of human rights, personal freedom, religious liberty, and social justice. When Americans disagree about abortion, they aren't merely disputing a medical procedure but engaging with profound questions about when life begins, bodily autonomy, and the proper relationship between personal morality and public policy. The statistical evidence of this moral sorting is striking. Recent polling from Gallup's 2025 Ideology survey shows that 55% of Democrats identify as liberal and 77% of Republicans as conservative, record highs that reflect increasing ideological sorting. These numbers represent a significant shift from previous decades when both parties contained substantial moderate wings. The percentage of Americans who identify as moderates has reached a record low of 34%, indicating a shrinking middle ground where compromise might be negotiated. This ideological sorting extends beyond abstract political labels to affect personal relationships. A 2024 study found that 42% of Americans have ended friendships due to political disagreements. This statistic reveals how today's moral conflicts penetrate the most intimate spheres of American life. Unlike the geographically concentrated moral divisions of the 1850s, today's moral conflicts create divisions within families, friend groups, workplaces, and communities. The battle lines run not between states, but through dinner tables and social media feeds. Religious institutions again find themselves divided over moral questions, echoing the denominational splits of the pre-Civil War era. Mainline and evangelical Protestant denominations have experienced painful separations over issues like same-sex marriage, with some churches leaving their denominations rather than accepting changing doctrinal positions. Catholic parishes often reflect similar divides between progressive and traditional interpretations of church teaching. These religious divisions both reflect and reinforce the broader moral fragmentation in American society. Unlike 1861's clear regional moral divide, today's moral conflicts create patchworks of division that complicate potential resolution. The geographic distribution of these moral viewpoints doesn't align neatly with state boundaries, making traditional secession impractical. A conservative living in a progressive urban center might feel more ideologically aligned with rural conservatives across the country than with their neighbors. Similarly, progressives in conservative regions often feel more connected to distant urban centers than to their local communities. This creates a sense of cultural exile for many Americans who find themselves moral minorities in their immediate surroundings. The emotional intensity of these moral conflicts often stems from perceptions of existential threat. Many social conservatives view progressive social policies as threatening religious liberty and traditional family structures. Many progressives similarly view conservative positions as threatening hard-won civil rights and personal freedoms. Both sides increasingly frame disagreements not as good faith differences of opinion, but as conflicts between moral virtue and moral corruption. This framing leaves little room for compromise or mutual understanding. It's important to note, however, that despite the heated rhetoric, research from the Polarization Research Lab indicates that fewer than 4% of Americans support political violence as of 2024. This suggests that while our divisions are real, most citizens still reject extreme measures to resolve them. Nevertheless, the perception that the other side poses an existential threat continues to drive polarization in ways that make democratic compromise increasingly difficult. The corporate world has not been immune to these cultural battles. Major companies like Amazon and Google have scaled back diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in response to political pressure, highlighting how these moral conflicts extend beyond government into private institutions. These corporate decisions become flashpoints in the broader cultural conflict, with each side viewing them as either necessary corrections or troubling retreats from social progress. Social media amplifies these divisions by creating echo chambers where Americans encounter primarily viewpoints that align with their existing beliefs. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement often promote the most emotionally charged content, further reinforcing perceptions that the opposing side is not merely mistaken, but morally bankrupt. The result is a landscape where Americans increasingly inhabit different moral universes, each with its own facts, authorities, and values. While these cultural conflicts lack slavery's unique combination of moral, economic, and constitutional elements, they create similar perceptions of existential threat. The key difference lies in the distribution of these conflicts rather than their intensity. When moral divisions aligned with geographic regions in the 1850s, physical separation through secession became a conceivable response. Today's moral geography makes such separation impractical, potentially creating more pervasive forms of division that resist clear resolution. This moral fragmentation raises a critical question about our shared national future. How can Americans maintain a functioning democracy when they increasingly operate from entirely different perceptions of reality? The answer requires understanding how information shapes these divergent worldviews and how the media landscape itself contributes to our growing division. Information ecosystems, from partisan press to digital bubbles. The fractured information landscape of America reveals how citizens increasingly inhabit separate realities. Throughout American history, the media has played a crucial role in shaping public perception, but today's digital environment has transformed this influence in unprecedented ways. Both the 1850s and our current era demonstrate how divided information ecosystems can undermine the shared understanding necessary for democratic functioning. In the 1850s, Americans increasingly consumed news from partisan newspapers that presented entirely different versions of events. This wasn't simply bias or spin. These publications often reported fundamentally contradictory accounts of the same incidents. Northern papers portrayed slavery as a moral abomination and emphasized its cruelties, while Southern publications defended it as a positive institution and focused on instances of contented, enslaved people. These weren't just different interpretations of the same facts, but entirely different. Factual claims about reality itself. The consequences became evident in how Northern and Southern newspapers reported on events like Bleeding Kansas or John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. When violence erupted in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers, Southern papers described the free soil settlers as dangerous radicals threatening Southern rights, while Northern papers portrayed the same people as brave defenders of freedom against pro-slavery aggressors. These contradictory narratives meant citizens developed fundamentally incompatible understandings of events that should have been matters of straightforward reporting. This information divide produced dangerous misunderstandings by 1860. Many Southerners genuinely believed Lincoln planned to immediately abolish slavery if elected, despite his explicit statements that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. Southern papers had portrayed him as a radical abolitionist, ignoring or distorting his actual positions. Simultaneously, many Northerners underestimated Southern secession threats, dismissing them as political bluster rather than serious declarations of intent. These misperceptions, fueled by partisan media, made peaceful resolution increasingly impossible as each side responded to versions of reality the other side didn't recognize. Today's media landscape has similarly fractured, but with technologies that make the division even more pervasive and personalized. A 2022 Pew Research Center study found that 79% of Americans believe social media has made people more divided in their political opinions. This isn't just perception. Research consistently shows that social media algorithms create echo chambers where users primarily encounter information that confirms their existing beliefs while limiting exposure to contradictory perspectives. The algorithm-driven nature of modern media creates filter bubbles that function similarly to the partisan newspapers of the 1850s, but with greater precision and reach. While antebellum newspapers had limited circulation within specific geographic areas, today's digital platforms operate globally, connecting like-minded individuals across vast distances. In the 1850s, readers at least had to consciously choose a Democratic or Whig newspaper. Today's digital platforms invisibly curate information based on past behavior, creating personalized information environments without users actively selecting them. This filtering process means two Americans can experience entirely different information landscapes while using the same platforms. A conservative and a progressive might both use Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, but encounter radically different content, personalities, and interpretations of current events. According to Pew Research, approximately 31% of Americans regularly get their news from Facebook, while 27% turn to Twitter, creating multiple parallel information streams rather than the few dozen partisan newspapers that existed in the 1850s. Unlike the regional information divide of the 1850s, today's information bubbles create ideological enclaves that transcend geography but are potentially more isolating. Pre-Civil War Americans at least shared physical communities where some cross-partisan interaction remained possible. Today, digital tribes can form without geographic constraints, allowing people to construct information environments where they rarely encounter serious challenges to their worldview regardless of where they live. This transformation of our information ecosystem has profound implications for democratic governance. When citizens no longer share a common understanding of basic facts, democratic processes struggle to resolve conflicts through normal channels. Democracy depends on citizens reaching different conclusions from the same evidence, not on citizens operating from entirely different sets of facts. The former allows for debate and potential compromise. The latter makes these processes nearly impossible. Social media has accelerated political tribalism in ways impossible in the 19th century, creating parallel information realities that make compromise increasingly difficult. The partisan newspapers of the 1850s were powerful divisive forces, but they operated within technological constraints that limited their reach and personalization. Today's digital platforms can target specific messages to specific audiences with unprecedented precision, creating more effective echo chambers than anything possible in previous eras. What remains consistent across both eras is how fractured information environments undermine the possibility of shared truth upon which democratic governance depends. When Americans increasingly inhabit separate factual universes, they cannot effectively deliberate together about solutions to common problems. The issues become not just matters of different values or priorities, but disagreements about the nature of reality itself. The question becomes whether our institutions can still function effectively when citizens operate from fundamentally different understandings of reality. This challenge extends beyond the media to our governing institutions themselves, particularly those designed to stand above partisan politics and provide impartial judgment. When even these institutions become viewed through partisan lenses, the foundations of democratic governance face their greatest test. Supreme Court controversies, from Dred Scott to modern judicial politics. The institutions designed to stand above partisan politics face their greatest test when they become battlegrounds in our cultural conflicts. The Supreme Court, meant to be our impartial constitutional arbiter, has experienced legitimacy crises in both the 1850s and today that reveal disturbing parallels in how judicial authority can amplify rather than resolve national divisions. In 1857, the Supreme Court attempted to permanently resolve the slavery question through the Dred Scott decision. The case centered on an enslaved man who had lived in free territories with his owner before returning to the slave state of Missouri. Scott argued that his residence in free territory had made him legally free. The court could have issued a narrow ruling focused on Scott's specific circumstances, but Chief Justice Roger Taney and the Southern-dominated court chose a much broader approach. Taney's ruling went far beyond the case at hand, making two sweeping declarations that shocked the North. First, he held that people of African descent could never be citizens of the United States, regardless of whether they were free or enslaved. This effectively denied them any constitutional rights whatsoever. Second, and perhaps more consequentially, Taney declared that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in any federal territory. This invalidated the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery in territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes parallel, and effectively opened all federal territories to slavery. The ruling came from a court with a clear sectional imbalance. Of the 9 justices, 6 were from southern states, and 7 voted with the majority. This southern majority reflected what northerners viewed as the political capture of the judiciary. Rather than an impartial reading of the Constitution, they saw Southern justices imposing their regional viewpoint as constitutional law, effectively nationalizing the Southern position on slavery through judicial fiat. For Northerners, the decision destroyed the court's legitimacy. Newspapers across the North denounced the ruling as a political act rather than a judicial one. The Republican Party explicitly rejected the decision, arguing that it had no binding authority beyond Scott's individual case. Abraham Lincoln dedicated significant portions of his famous debates with Stephen Douglas to attacking the legal reasoning of the Dred Scott decision. When the institution designed to be the final arbiter of constitutional questions lost its legitimacy in the eyes of half the country, one of the key mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution effectively disappeared. Today's Supreme Court faces remarkably similar legitimacy challenges. Public confidence in the court has declined significantly in recent years, reflecting a growing perception that it functions as a political body rather than an independent institution devoted to constitutional interpretation. The contentious confirmation processes for recent justices have reinforced this perception. In 2016, the Senate refused to hold hearings for Merrick Garland's nomination, keeping the seat vacant for over a year. In stark contrast, Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed just 2 weeks before the 2020 election by a 52-48 vote. These contrasting approaches struck many Americans as nakedly political maneuvers rather than good faith exercises of constitutional authority. The emotional confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh further polarized public opinion about the court's composition and legitimacy. These controversial confirmations created a court that increasingly issues decisions along predictable ideological lines on the most contentious issues facing the nation. Major rulings on abortion, voting rights, and presidential power have divided the justices in ways that closely track their appointing presidents' political affiliations. This pattern reinforces the view that constitutional interpretation follows political preference rather than objective legal analysis. The court's decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe v. Wade, particularly echoes the divisiveness of the Dred Scott ruling. Just as Dred Scott represented a dramatic reversal of previous understandings about federal power over territories, Dobbs explicitly overturned a 49-year precedent that many Americans had come to view as settled law. The geographic divisions in reaction to both rulings are similarly striking, with some states quickly moving to ban practices that others consider fundamental rights. When the institution designed to be above politics becomes seen as captured by one side, it loses its ability to resolve conflicts peacefully. The Supreme Court's unique role in American governance depends on what scholars call diffuse support, the willingness of citizens to accept rulings they disagree with because they trust the institution itself. When that trust erodes, compliance becomes contingent on agreement with outcomes rather than respect for the process. This creates a dangerous cycle. As the court is increasingly viewed as political, presidents face greater pressure to appoint justices who will reliably support their political agenda. These appointments further politicize the court, reducing its legitimacy still further. The end point of this cycle is a judiciary that can no longer effectively resolve constitutional disputes because its decisions are seen as merely political acts cloaked in legal language. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision inflamed tensions in the 1850s, just as today's court controversies further erode trust in institutions designed to peacefully resolve conflicts. In both eras, the court's apparent alignment with one side of a deeply divided nation undermined its ability to serve as a neutral arbiter. This raises profound questions about whether our judiciary can regain its perceived legitimacy or whether it will continue to accelerate division as it did in the 1850s. Understanding these institutional failures requires examining another crucial dimension of our national division, the geographic distribution of our political identity versus modern and how they shape the potential for conflict of division. The physical landscape of American division reveals why today's conflicts may take different forms than those of the past. The geographic distribution of our political allegiances shapes not just how conflicts emerge, but what forms they ultimately take. Understanding this geographic dimension helps explain why our current divisions, while serious, may manifest differently than the clean sectional break of the Civil War era. In 1861, regional identity formed the foundation of political loyalty, with citizens often identifying as Virginians or New Yorkers before Americans. This local attachment wasn't merely sentimental. It shaped fundamental understandings of citizenship and governance. Robert E. Lee captured this mindset when he resigned his U.S. Army commission, writing that he could not draw his sword against his native Virginia, despite his opposition to secession. This prioritization of state identity over national identity wasn't unusual for the time. It reflected a constitutional understanding where states were seen as the primary political communities, with the federal government serving as their creation rather than their superior. This strong regional identity created geographically coherent blocks that could mobilize military forces and control territory, prerequisites for traditional civil war. When Virginia seceded, it could draw upon the loyalty of its citizens, the authority of its state government, and control of its physical territory to support its decision. These geographically concentrated loyalties allowed for the creation of the Confederacy as a functioning alternative government with defined borders, armies, and civil administration. Southern states had distinct cultures, economies, and social structures that created a shared sectional identity capable of supporting secession. The plantation economy, dependence on enslaved labor, and aristocratic social structures fostered a regional consciousness that transcended state boundaries while remaining geographically coherent. Southerners increasingly viewed themselves as culturally and economically distinct from Northerners, with different values, priorities, and ways of life. This shared sectional identity provided the social foundation for political separation. Today's divisions follow different geographic patterns, with the primary divide between urban and rural areas rather than between contiguous regions. The most accurate political map of America isn't red states versus blue states, but rather urban centers versus rural counties, with suburban areas often serving as competitive battlegrounds. This pattern appears consistently across the country, from Texas to New York, Georgia to California. Major cities generally lean Democratic, while rural areas typically support Republicans, regardless of which region they occupy. Modern political maps show a patchwork of blue urban centers and red rural areas across all states, creating what some analysts call Purple America. This intermixed pattern means no state is uniformly conservative or progressive. Texas provides a clear example containing heavily Republican rural counties alongside Democratic urban centers like Austin, where progressive policies thrive just hours away from deeply conservative communities. This pattern repeats across the nation, creating a complex political geography that defies simple regional categorization. This geographic intermixing makes traditional secession or civil war nearly impossible, as no region can cleanly separate from others. Unlike 1861, when relatively distinct geographic regions could contemplate separation, today's political geography doesn't permit clean breaks along state lines. Any attempt at regional secession would immediately face the problem of what to do with large populations of the opposing political tribe within the seceding territory. The resulting boundaries would be impractical and ultimately unsustainable. The economic geography reinforces this complexity. Urban areas that typically lean Democratic generate approximately 70% of America's GDP, while rural counties that tend to vote Republican provide the remaining 30%. This economic interdependence creates practical barriers to separation that didn't exist in the more economically self-sufficient regions of 1861. The rise of social media and cable news has further amplified these divisions, creating echo chambers that reinforce existing biases. These information ecosystems allow for the formation of political communities that transcend geography. Conservatives in urban areas can find psychological community with rural conservatives through digital connections, just as progressives in conservative regions can maintain links with like-minded citizens elsewhere. This creates a situation where political tribes exist across geographic space rather than being concentrated in specific regions. While this geographic reality prevents a repeat of 1861's secession crisis, it creates the potential for different forms of conflict. The intermixing of political opponents throughout the national territory means conflict might emerge not as regional separation, but as more distributed forms of resistance, noncompliance, or even violence. When geographic separation isn't possible, political tensions must find other expressions. Regional identity played a crucial role in 1861 versus our current urban-rural divide, making traditional secession unlikely today. The geographic coherence of Southern identity provided both the practical means and psychological foundation for secession. Today's more complex geographic distribution of political identities prevents such a clean break, but doesn't eliminate the underlying tensions. It simply channels them into different forms. The question becomes what forms of division might emerge when geographic separation isn't possible, but deep polarization persists. Without the option of territorial separation, how might serious political conflicts manifest? The answer may be more complex than we imagine, requiring us to look beyond traditional models of civil conflict to understand potential threats to national unity. Alternative conflict scenarios beyond traditional civil war. The distribution of political divisions across America's landscape creates conditions for conflict that may look nothing like the Civil War. While a traditional North-South military confrontation seems unlikely, other concerning scenarios deserve serious attention. These alternative forms of conflict don't require armies facing each other across battlefields to threaten national cohesion and democratic governance. Political violence has already increased in recent years, with January 6, 2021 representing perhaps the most visible manifestation of this danger. When thousands of protesters stormed the U.S. Capitol attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, they caused millions in damages and left 5 people dead. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of increasing political violence that includes targeted attacks on political figures, violent confrontations at protests, and rising threats against public officials. Rather than organized armies, modern conflict might involve distributed networks of extremist groups engaging in coordinated but decentralized violence. This shift from traditional warfare to decentralized violence characterizes many contemporary conflicts worldwide. These groups often utilize social media and other online platforms to coordinate activities, spread propaganda, and recruit new members, making them difficult to track and counter. Without geographic concentration, such networks can operate across state lines while maintaining ideological coherence. This pattern creates what security experts sometimes call networked insurgency, conflict that lacks clear front lines or territorial control, but nonetheless poses serious threats to security and governance. We've seen elements of this approach in various extremist movements that combine online radicalization with real-world violence. The challenge for authorities lies in addressing these threats without overreaching in ways that further erode civil liberties and trust in government. State governments increasingly defy federal authority on issues from immigration to abortion, creating a form of soft secession through noncompliance. This defiance takes many forms, including state laws that contradict federal mandates, refusal to cooperate with federal law enforcement, and the establishment of sanctuary cities or states. Such actions challenge the federal government's power and can lead to legal battles and increased tensions. This state-level resistance doesn't constitute formal secession, but creates a fractured legal landscape where citizens experience different rights and obligations depending on where they live. When states actively resist federal authority, they effectively create parallel governance systems that undermine national cohesion. The resulting legal uncertainty affects everything from healthcare access to voting rights to environmental protection. Economic fragmentation could occur as states create separate regulatory environments and companies align with political tribes, creating parallel economic systems. We already see elements of this in how companies increasingly position themselves on political issues, with some businesses explicitly marketing to conservative or progressive consumers. States similarly compete to create business environments that reflect their political values, whether through tax policies, labor regulations, or environmental standards. This economic sorting could accelerate, creating distinct regional economies with different rules, incentives, and business cultures. Companies might increasingly relocate based on ideological alignment rather than purely economic considerations. The long-term result could be a fragmented national market where commerce itself becomes politicized, further reinforcing divisions between Americans who already share less common ground. Information warfare through disinformation campaigns and cyberattacks presents a form of conflict unknown in the 19th century, but potentially just as destabilizing. According to Pew Research, 70% of Americans see the spread of false information as a major threat to the country. This concern is well-founded. The proliferation of misinformation through social media and other online platforms erodes trust in institutions, fuels political divisions, and can incite violence. Cyberattacks can disrupt critical infrastructure, such as power grids and financial systems, causing widespread chaos and damage. These digital battlegrounds create conflict spaces where traditional concepts of territory become irrelevant. Foreign actors can exploit and amplify domestic divisions, adding another dimension to potential conflict scenarios. The anonymity of many digital spaces makes attribution difficult, creating environments where trust erodes and conspiracy theories flourish. These alternative conflict scenarios might not match the dramatic break of 1861, but could still fundamentally alter American democracy and unity. The danger lies not in a single catastrophic rupture, but in the cumulative effect of these various forms of division. Democratic institutions depend on shared understanding, mutual trust, and willingness to accept legitimate authority. When these foundations erode through multiple channels simultaneously, democracy itself becomes vulnerable. Understanding these potential scenarios helps us recognize warning signs and take steps to prevent escalation before reaching critical points of no return. By identifying these alternative conflict pathways, we can develop more effective responses that address the unique challenges of 21st century division. Traditional approaches to preventing civil conflict may prove inadequate against these newer threats that don't require territorial control or military mobilization. The question isn't whether America will experience another 1861-style civil war. Our geographic and institutional realities make that specific scenario unlikely. The more relevant question is whether these alternative forms of conflict might produce equally damaging outcomes through different mechanisms. Fortunately, modern America has developed safeguards against national fracture that weren't present in the 19th century, potentially creating a different trajectory for our current divisions. Institutional safeguards. What's different this time? Despite the concerning parallels between our current moment and pre-Civil War America, several crucial institutional differences exist today that weren't present in 1861. These structural safeguards, while not guaranteeing national unity, create significant barriers to the kind of clean break that led to secession and war. Understanding these differences helps us assess both the nature and likelihood of potential national division in our time. The federal government is vastly more powerful and present in daily life than in 1861, making secession logistically and practically more difficult. In the antebellum period, the federal government remained relatively distant from citizens' daily experiences. Many Americans could live their entire lives with minimal interaction with federal authorities beyond the post office. Today's federal government, by contrast, touches virtually every aspect of American life through more than 200 federal programs, regulations, and agencies that oversee state actions. Programs like Social Security alone provide benefits that lift over 34 million Americans above the poverty line, creating direct relationships between citizens and their federal government. Consider the practical challenges of secession in this environment. A state attempting to separate would need to recreate countless federal functions, from air traffic control to food safety inspection to border security. The sheer administrative complexity would be daunting even before addressing any potential military response. This increased federal capacity serves as a structural barrier to the kind of separation that occurred in 1861. Economic integration is far deeper today, with supply chains, financial systems, and infrastructure creating interdependencies that would make separation catastrophically costly. The modern economy functions as a highly integrated network where goods, services, and capital flow continuously across state lines. Major corporations operate across multiple states, with production, distribution, and management often spread throughout the country. Financial systems connect markets nationally and globally in ways that would make economic separation extraordinarily painful. This integration means that any attempt at secession would immediately trigger economic disruption far beyond what Southern states experienced in 1861. Modern economies depend on complex supply chains that will be severely disrupted by new borders, regulations, or currencies. The economic costs would be immediate and severe, creating strong practical incentives against separation, even among those who might find it politically appealing. The professional military has a strong institutional culture of political neutrality and constitutional loyalty that would resist being drawn into domestic conflict. Unlike the officer corps of 1861, which divided largely along regional lines, today's military maintains a strong institutional commitment to political neutrality and constitutional order. Military leaders receive extensive training in constitutional principles and civilian control of the military. This professional ethos makes it much less likely that the armed forces would fragment along political lines as they did during the Civil War. The military's commitment to the Constitution rather than to specific political leaders provides a critical safeguard against the use of armed forces in domestic political conflicts. While individual service members hold diverse political views, the institution itself maintains a strong culture of nonpartisanship that would resist attempts to use military power for partisan purposes. International connections create external constraints on internal conflict that didn't exist in the relatively isolated America of 1861. The United States now exists within a global network of alliances, trade relationships, and international institutions that would be disrupted by serious internal conflict. This international dimension was largely absent during the Civil War era, when America remained relatively isolated from global affairs, creating another layer of constraint against national fracturing. Social safety net programs create direct relationships between citizens and the federal government that would be difficult to sever in any separation scenario. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid provide essential services to millions of Americans, creating direct connections between citizens and the federal government. These relationships would be jeopardized by secession, as new political entities would need to recreate these complex systems or risk leaving their citizens without critical benefits. These institutional differences don't prevent all forms of conflict, but do create significant barriers to the kind of clean break that occurred in 1861. While they protect against traditional secession, they don't necessarily prevent other forms of division, such as increased state autonomy, political violence, or institutional degradation. The safeguards may channel conflict into different forms rather than preventing it entirely. The strength of these institutional safeguards ultimately depends on public trust and legitimacy. As polarization deepens, these foundations can erode, potentially weakening even the strongest institutional protections. Our challenge lies in strengthening these safeguards while addressing the underlying divisions that threaten them. Examining both the parallels and differences between 1861 and today reveals a complex picture of our national situation. The similarities are concerning enough to warrant serious attention, but the differences suggest that history won't simply repeat itself in predictable ways. Looking forward, we must recognize the unique challenges of our time while drawing lessons from history's darkest chapter. Our examination reveals both warning signs and reasons for cautious optimism. While we face serious divisions, fractured information ecosystems, political gridlock, and cultural battles, we lack the singular moral crisis that slavery presented. Our institutional safeguards are stronger, our economy more integrated, and our military more unified than in the antebellum period. The danger we face isn't a sudden break along geographic lines, but a gradual unraveling of democratic norms and institutions. What's at stake isn't a traditional civil war, but something perhaps more insidious, the slow erosion of our capacity to govern ourselves as one nation despite our differences.